Committee will come to order. Committee welcomes Mr. David Norquist, the Undersecretary of Defense, Comptroller, and Chief Financial Officer as our witness today. The topic is the audit of the Department of Defense, which by law begins this fiscal year. And I would just say it is not by accident that the committee will start our year on this topic. Requiring that the department conduct an audit has been a bipartisan priority of this committee for some time. The Chief Financial Officer Act of 1990 required all federal departments conduct an annual financial audit, and partly out of frustration with the lack of progress toward that end at the Department of Defense, the 2010 NDAA required the financial statements of the department be ready for audit by September 30, 2017. This committee's panel on defense financial management and auditability reform put close scrutiny on the department's efforts and issued a number of recommendations that have enabled us to arrive at this point. The 2014 NDAA again required a full audit be conducted of the department's FY18 financial statements, the results of which are to be delivered next year. I want to commend Chairman Conaway for his expertise and his persistence on this issue, as well as Mr. Courtney, who was also a member of the audit panel several years ago. They will both be glad to know that we have had additional members join this committee in recent years who can also contribute their background and experience to this issue as it moves ahead. This issue is important. Members of this committee hear evidence every week that we are not providing our military with the funding they need to carry out the missions they have been assigned. We must spend more. At the same time, we have a responsibility to the American people to see that each of their tax dollars being spent to protect them is being spent in a transparent way with appropriate accountability. We should never assume that an audit will solve all the problems of waste and inefficiency, but it seems to me that an essential requirement of spending money smarter is knowing with certainty how it is being spent. It is likely that the result of the first audit will not be pretty, but those results will help direct us all, Congress and the Department, on where we need to apply our efforts to improve. This issue is important, and this committee will continue to pursue it. Ranking members recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And by and large, I would simply repeat word for word the opening statement of the chairman. So in the interest of time, I won't do that. And we'll simplify it by saying that this is enormously important. There are a lot of concerns at the Pentagon, and there's really two big issues here. One is, as the chairman mentioned, we are in a time of very tight resources and very great needs. And that means we have to get everything we can out of every dollar we spend. There are many, many issues that this committee has covered that make that clear. And second, if we can't explain where we spend the money in the Pentagon, we are failing in that first mission. I know it's a lot of money. I know it's a big bureaucracy. I know there's a lot going on, but we ought to be able to do an audit that tells us where we're spending the money. It's just that simple. And, that's your mission. It's the Pentagon's mission. I, too, want to specifically thank Mr. Conaway for his great leadership in this issue. Who knew having an accountant on the committee would be critical? Well, actually, most people should have known that. But he's done a great job on this issue. Appreciate his leadership. And I just hope that, I think everybody on this committee would just feel great if at some point this year we can say the Pentagon has been audited. It has happened some 20 years after we started trying to make it happen. I think we're close. I think we can get there. I look forward to hearing your testimony about how we're progressing in that. And I thank the chairman for his leadership on this very important issue.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Norquist, welcome. Without objection, your full written statement will be made part of the record, and you are recognized to make any oral comments you wish to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to provide an overview of the Department's financial statement audit progress and plans. I appreciate your committee's long and unwavering support for this effort. I also want to thank Congressman Conaway for his leadership over the years related to the audit. His direction of the committee's 2011 panel on financial management and auditability helped the Department maintain its focus on audit. When the President made a promise to the American people to rebuild the U.S. Armed Forces, he also made a commitment to start the audit. Inside the Department of Defense, Secretary Mattis and Deputy Secretary Shanahan have set a tone from the top that embraces the audit as part of their vision to bring business reform to the Department of Defense. I know you have had many hearings where witnesses have told you that they support the start of an audit eventually. This hearing is different. We have started the audit, but we are only able to have today's hearing with the Department of Defense under its first full financial statement audit because of this committee's continued support. I should note that audits themselves are not new to the Department of Defense. Numerous audits covering program performance and contract costs are completed each year by the Government Accountability Office, the Defense Contract Audit Agency, the Department of Defense Office of the Inspector General, and the Service Audit Agencies. For example, DCAA employs over 4,000 auditors to perform contract audits that are focused on identifying inappropriate charges by contractors to the government. However, this is the first time that the Department is undergoing a full financial statement audit. A financial statement audit is comprehensive. It occurs annually, and it covers more than financial management. For example, financial statement audits include verifying count, location, and condition of military equipment, real property, and inventory. It tests the security vulnerabilities of our business systems, and it validates the accuracy of personnel records and actions, such as promotions and separations. The Department of Defense anticipates that this spring and early summer, we will have approximately 1,200 financial statement auditors assessing whether our books and records present a true and accurate picture of our financial condition and results of our operations in accordance with accounting standards. These financial statement audits complement, but are distinct from program performance or contract audits. Based on my experience at the Department of Homeland Security, it will take time to implement all the process and system changes necessary to pass the audit. It took the Department of Homeland Security, a relatively new and smaller enterprise, about 10 years to get its first clean opinion. But we don't have to wait for a clean opinion to see the benefits of the audit. The financial statement audit helps drive enterprise-wide improvements to standardize our business processes and improve the quality of our data. Just like private sector companies and other federal agencies, the Department of Defense prepares financial statements every year to report its assets, liabilities, revenues, and expenses. Though not a corporation, DOD owes accountability to the American people. The taxpayers deserve the same level of confidence as a shareholder that DOD's financial statements present a true and accurate picture of its financial condition and operations. Transparency, accountability, and business process reform are some of the benefits of a financial statement audit. Regarding transparency, the audit improves the quality of our financial statements and the underlying data that we make available to the public, including a reliable picture of our assets, liabilities, and spending. And DOD's progress towards a positive audit opinion will also directly contribute to an audit opinion on the entire federal government's assets and liabilities. With regard to accounting, the audit will highlight areas where we need to improve our accountability over assets and resources. For example, during an initial audit, the Army found 39 Black Hawk helicopters that had not been properly recorded in its property system. The Air Force identified 478 buildings and structures at 12 installations that were not in its real property system. By fixing the property records, we can help demonstrate the accountability of our assets. In other cases, as the Department invests in new business systems, we will be able to obtain independent auditor feedback on that system's compliance so we can better hold those vendors accountable for their solutions. Third, the combination of better data, business process reengineering, and the use of modern data analytics directly supports Congress's vision of the Chief Management Officer position and the Department's effort to bring business reforms to its operations. These reforms will lead to business operations savings that can be reinvested in lethality. The cost of performing the audit will be about $367 million in FY 2008. This amount covers the audit fees to the independent public accounting firms, about $181 million, and the infrastructure, including the cost of the government salaries of the people supporting the audit, of about $186 million. The $181 million in audit contract costs is 1/30 of 1% of the DOD budget, and as a percentage of revenue is equal to or less than what a Fortune 100 company such as General Electric, Procter & Gamble, or IBM pays for their auditors. In addition, we anticipate spending about $551 million in 2018 fixing problems identified by the auditors. The DOD consolidated audit will likely be one of the largest audits ever undertaken and comprises more than 24 standalone audits and an overarching consolidated audit. DOD is currently sustaining clean opinions for 9 standalone audits. Our audits are conducted by IPA firms, with the DOD IG performing the consolidated audit, and all the contract audits have been awarded and the auditors have begun to arrive. In order to track progress, the Department has established a tool and a process to capture, prioritize, assign responsibility for, and develop corrective actions for audit findings. Each year, the auditors will assess and report on whether the Department has successfully addressed the findings. Going forward, we will measure progress and report on it towards achieving a positive opinion by using the number of findings resolved. In closing, I want to thank this committee for its continued focus on the importance of a DOD audit. Your oversight through the years has been a catalyst, and we appreciate the partnership we enjoy with you and with the committee staff on this important process. With your oversight and under this administration's leadership, we are now and will continue to be a department that is not only under audit, but improving year after year. As we move forward, your continued support for budget stability, related information technology, and funding to remediate audit findings remains critical in moving the department towards achieving a positive opinion. I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, sir. And I appreciate your differentiating what we're talking about here, a full financial audit with contract audits. I might just highlight that we had a number of provisions to reform the contract audit process in the last year's Defense Authorization Bill, and hopefully that will improve as well. I just want to ask you one question. I was interested to read where a retired general says basically this audit is not worth doing. Mm-hmm. As you highlight, it requires going and checking the real property. You've got to check and see whether all the weapons and equipment are accounted for, the various records and so forth. It's going to be expensive. And as his point basically is, it's not worth the cost. Now, you're doing it because the law requires you to, understand. But what would be your response to the argument that the cost is more than the benefit of doing a full financial audit of the department? Sure.
I would first respond. He noted that referred to the audit as costing over $800 to $900 million. The amount we're paying the IPAs, $181 million, is 1/30 of 1% of the budget. This is not a significant, I mean, it's, any number that ends in millions is a large number, but on the scale of the enterprise, that type of money for accountability is money well spent. The additional money, the $500 to $600 million we've talked about, is to fix problems that we find. Now, this is always a choice going forward. If we can live with the problem, we can fix it. But I don't think operating in ignorance of the problem is the right way forward. I fully support the committee and the legislative direction. Conduct the audit, do the findings. Some of the things I'll point out is the article said that's expensive because it covers so much. And the answer is yes, that's the point. You know, one of the things that the law requires is that we do information security of our business systems. This is the FISMA and FISCAM standards. The audits are done to those. We will be able to understand the weaknesses and do more to hold people accountable for closing cybersecurity vulnerabilities in our systems. You would want that anyhow. You would want that done under any circumstance. And when we find those, you will want the department to be closing them. The other comment is they talked about there are other ways to do this. Yes, there are. And you talked about contract audits. While the defense financial statement is large, 1,200 auditors, we have 4,000 who look at contractors. So on the scale of what we spend looking at contractors, the size of the team that we look at the government is appropriate and proportionate. Lastly, I think the biggest concern I have is there's a statement that they make that The department is not a corporation and does not need to undergo a strict financial audit. Well, first of all, the law requires a financial audit, and more importantly, I think the taxpayers deserve at least the same level of confidence as a shareholder in the use of their money.
Thank you. Ms. Smith.
I don't have a question. I just want to totally agree with your remarks that you just made. It's, you know, to say that it's not worth doing, it's like say, hey, we've screwed it up so bad for so long that, you know, the cost of fixing it has just become overwhelming, so just let us keep screwing it up. And I get that the upfront cost is going to be enormous, but long term, the benefits are exactly as you describe. And if it, you know, if we got to sort of suck it up for a couple of years and absorb some costs to get back on track, it's going to make significant improvements going there. Because all of the work on acquisition reform that I know the chairman and I and many others have done can be so much better informed if we have this information. All right, we can say, oh, well, gosh, here's an area that we, instead of, so when we pass legislation aimed at making the acquisition process better, if we have this full audit, that legislation has a much better chance of actually accomplishing that task. So yeah, it's pretty bad, and in some ways you'd like to just sort of close your eyes and say, let's just not deal with it. But it's just too important for all the reasons you stated. So I completely agree with that statement. I applaud your commitment to doing this and stand ready to have the committee help you in any way we can. So I'll yield back my time. If you have a comment, you may, but I have nothing further.
My only comment is to reinforce your point about the better data to support information. I mean, the primary thing an audit promises is better data accuracy and accountability. And when many of the other reforms depend on the accuracy of that data, not having it complicates those efforts.
Mr. Jones.
Chairman, thank you. And I've been here 22 years, and this is the best news of hoping for something good to come from this effort. And I commend my friends on my side and the other side who worked with the chairman, ranking member, to put this effort together. I never will forget Donald Rumsfeld, the former Secretary of State, Defense, sitting where you are, telling this committee that he will account for every dollar of the taxpayer and how it's going to be spent at the Department of Defense. He might have meant that well, but it never happened, obviously, because that's why you're here today, because we've never been able to do anything to take a problem and even in a small way make it better. I got one question. It does deal not directly with you, but because of your position and your oversight. Of all the articles I've seen about waste in the 22 years I've been here, probably this is in the top 4 or 5. It's from 2 years ago. U.S. Army fudged accounts by trillions of dollars, auditors found. The Defense Department Inspector General in a June report 2 years ago said the Army made a $2.8 trillion in wrongful adjustments to accounting entries in 1 quarter alone in 2015 and $6.5 trillion for the year. Yet the Army lacked receipts and invoices to support these numbers or simply make them up or simply made them up. This would be something I would think would be under your department's jurisdiction if it happened within the system. This is one of those things that I would like to ask you, how in the world do you fix a problem when you keep funding the problem? And there's got to be, you fellow CPAs and accountants can give me some assurance that when stories like this go public and the taxpayer reads it, Mr. Norquist, that's why they're so frustrated with Congress and why we have an 18% approval rating. So I would hope that this would be a kind of a situation that you can, in a short period of time, give me some hope that this would be dealt with, and somebody, instead of saying that, well, this happened and that happened, but we keep funding it. I just don't know how you catch up when you keep funding the problem.
So let me address that because that's a very important one. One of the issues you're talking about relates to journal vouchers, which occurs after the money is spent. So when you see an article that says trillions of dollars and you realize we only receive about 600 billion in a year, there's a mismatch in the story. And what this refers to is we have systems that do not automatically pass data from one to the other. So the Army goes in and others at the end of their financial statements, finds the number from their property book and writes it into their general ledger. That is called a journal voucher entry. Depending on the amount of property, that can be hundreds of billions of dollars. Because they don't have adequate support for that journal voucher, the whole entry is considered unsupported. Now, from a management point of view, this is bad. It's not the same thing as not being able to account for money that the Congress has given you to spend, but it's still a problem that needs to be fixed. And part of that relates to systems that were built as stovepipes. And in a private sector, they'd all talk to each other. You wouldn't let them field a system that didn't automatically pass up its data. So we are addressing exactly that type of challenge. And one of my concerns is only by eliminating the types of ones that are just an entry issue can you find underlying issues that are hidden among inaccurate data. So it's important. I wouldn't want the taxpayer to confuse that with with the loss of something like $1 trillion. It's not, that wouldn't be accurate. But it's an accounting problem that does need to be solved because it can help hide other underlying issues.
Mr. Norquist, thank you very much. I'm going to tell you that I might not be here when you resolve the problem, but I'll still be reading the paper. And I wish you and your staff the very best.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Norquist, for being here today. You know, this is my first year in Congress. And I will tell you that oftentimes I'm asked for my observations. I served in local government for over 24 years. And the most shocking thing about being in Congress is that there's never been a comprehensive audit of the DOD. Mm-hmm. It's just outright ridiculous. There's no other way of putting it. And it's been said that if you can't measure it, you can't evaluate it. Mm-hmm. And I think this is one of the most significant issues facing the American people and having trust in our being able to adequately fund our military and our Department of Defense. I think if we don't get it together, we're going to lose the American people's trust in what we're trying to do here. There's no question as to how daunting this task is going to be. The stakes are high. Last year, Congress approved almost $700 billion for the Department of Defense, and we owe it to the taxpayers to provide oversight and accountability over their tax dollars. Mm-hmm. Mr. Norquist, in your written testimony, you mentioned that for years, the department has received disclaimer of opinion on DOD-wide financial statements because it was not able to provide the evidence to support its financial information, and that these disclaimers were based on management's assertions and not based on independent audit testing. Can you provide some clarification and detail on this issue? What do you mean when you say it was based on management assertions and not independent audit testing? Because it is my understanding audits such as the one conducted for fiscal year 2015 was conducted by independent public accountants. If you could shed some light on that, I would greatly appreciate it.
Sure, I'd be happy to. There are a number of parts of the Department of Defense that have been under audit for a number of years: Defense Finance and Accounting Service, the commissaries, our pension plan, and so forth. And many of those receive clean audit opinions. But it is not the entire department. It is not even the majority of the department. And so when you don't have an auditor's opinion, management is not able to represent that everything's in order. And so the IG doesn't even begin the testing. They just said, then you've failed. This is one of the reasons why I have been a strong advocate and supporter of the audit. When I was at the Department of Homeland Security, when I arrived as the CFO there, they'd actually already had the audit the first year. But the amount of information you received from the audit as management in order to fix things was tremendous. And so I understand your concern of an entity that doesn't have an audit. That will provide a lot of useful information. And I think operating without it, there's a limit to how much you can reform and fix without that independent check validating that what was done was done correctly and effectively. And I think that's the biggest transition that we're going to see from this year to previous years.
Thank you. Once we see a Department of Defense audit for fiscal year 2018, how will DOD track its process for correcting errors? Specifically, how will the audit remediation process be executed, and what is the timeline for analysis, execution, and implementation of lessons learned from the audit?
So here's how we will do that. We've set up a data set where every time there's a finding by the auditor, what they call an NFR, Notice of Finding and Recommendations, and it's made up of several conditions, the auditors will enter that into the database. So we'll have their view for every entity of each of the findings, and they'll have codes according to the type. Was it against an IT system? Was it related to property? We'll then have an organization or individual associated with that NFR and the responsibility to correct it. This is important because it gets us past the habit of saying, does the department have a clean opinion? No. And then no one feeling that they individually are accountable. Here, all these findings will be associated with an organization, office, or individual who will be responsible for the corrective action plan. And I will be able to come back and report to you each year which of those were closed and which of those were not, who we should write to and say, well done, good job, and who either needs more help or more encouragement to get their piece of it done. But we will be able to track it finding by finding and hold accountable over time. And this is, again, one of the tools that the audit gives us as we move from the higher level, it's hard to solve, to very specific things. One of the things I like about that is you may have a large number of findings, and somebody says, well, why do I need to fix my piece? Look at how big the problem is. And this is, yes, but there are two assigned to you. If you can fix those two, that's all that you need to do. And then as more people do that, the whole organization moves in the right direction. So we will have that information for you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Lobiondo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to join with my colleagues in saying how much we look forward to your efforts and wish you good luck.
Thank you.
Certainly long overdue. And I want to take the opportunity to thank and applaud Mr. Conway for being so dogged in this with his hard work. And with that, I yield my time to Mr. Conway.
Right. Thank you, Frank. David, please pass on to your team. Thank you for where you've gotten us to today. The thousands and thousands of man hours, people hours, however you want to refer to it, that got you to however flawed we are at this point. We are far, far better off than when I first took up this task. And I, for one, have seen that progress. And so thank your team for it. Got a long way to go. Don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. The 18 audit is unlikely to be a clean opinion given the scope of what all has to be done, but we are so much further along based on the leadership that you and your team have provided and the hard work of the folks who every day get up and go to work to face this daunting problem that doesn't, it's like Sisyphus trying to push that rock up the hill every day and it get up the next morning, it's all the way back down to the bottom. So please tell them thank you. Sure. Part of what we'll try to do is to keep that process moving forward and not do anything that hampers from a legislative standpoint because we're frustrated that it hadn't gotten done sooner. We just have to recognize that it is getting done. Would you, you talked about findings, and that's got a certain definition to you. Would you explain to the committee what a finding it really is, what that means from an auditor standpoint, and why that's important that those get fixed?
Sure. So what the auditor does is they're holding the department accountable against certain well-recognized standards. And so the finding can consist of you were unable to produce the records to support this transaction, or we looked at your property system and it indicated you should have 100 of these, and when we walked the floor and looked at inventory, there are 95. They are basically things that are wrong in the way that either we are accounting for our assets or recording. And so then those are items that are priorities for us to fix.
So would those also include weaknesses in internal controls? You mentioned a circumstance where you had trillions of dollars of journal entries going back and forth. That's typically a failure of internal control. So the auditors are looking at your internal control system. Those findings would include weaknesses or failures within the internal control system.
Correct.
All right. While we're not going to get all the way to a clean opinion soon, you mentioned a couple of reasons why we've made, why it was important that we do this and value along the way. Can you expand on the 39 helicopters or the 400 buildings and why not knowing I mean, we obviously knew the pilots that were flying those 39 helicopters knew they were there, but somewhere further up the management chain, they disappeared from the inventory and may not have been known that they were there. 400 buildings made it seem like a big deal because they weren't moving, but at some point in time, we have to address a BRAC or something of that nature. Can you talk to us about value added along this path over the next couple of years that we will get as a result of doing these audits?
Absolutely. In order to get a clean opinion, there's a number of steps you have to solve. But even along the way, fixing the pieces along the way produce a tremendous benefit. So if you think of the inventory in a warehouse of how many spare parts or munitions you have, or the helicopters, those had been delivered by the vendor but hadn't been recorded in the property system, which meant folks who are anticipating using them were waiting to take advantage of it. Or if you have the case of the buildings, the person on the base may know they're there, but somebody at headquarters trying to figure out, do we have enough square footage where we need to do things, is operating with incomplete information. So as the leadership mentioned at the beginning, accurate data helps drive more accurate decision-making. There's a couple other benefits. For example, DISA, one of the agencies that's received a clean opinion on one of its funds and a modified on the other, was able to return $230 million to the services. It lowered its bills to them and allowed them to spend that money on operations and readiness because it had a more accurate understanding and a better management of its finances. Likewise, in terms of identifying errors, the Navy changed its process of how it handed information to DFAS to be more automated, reducing how much work DFAS had to do for them. That saved them $65 million. So while we're focused primarily on data accuracy, there are financial savings that come. And then there are other things which is just a benefit for the men and women of the armed forces. The Air Force, when they were doing a walkthrough, discovered their enlistment records were being set up incorrectly for new recruits as to whether they were 6- or 4-year enlistments. So they were updating manually hundreds of records every year as people arrived at the basic camp because the entry was done incorrectly at the beginning. They went back and did a system change to try to make sure that didn't happen, freed up a lot of labor hours, reduced by 80% the manpower accuracy issues. So it benefits the troops who better pay it and benefits accuracy.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're back.
Mr. O'Halloran.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to thank all those that have worked on this over the past decades. And as a new person, just like Mr. Carbajal and all those front row people, I'm kind of, after having read the information on this, I'm kind of shocked. You know, as a new person here, to look at decade after decade and trillions of dollars after trillions of dollars, and apparently no real rush to get to the point where we have an audit, a meaningful audit, is disturbing. But I do want to thank you for being here today to discuss this critical issue for our warfighters and American taxpayers, and thank you for your service. I want to echo my colleagues who have rightfully stated that proper financial oversight is long overdue at DOD. Waste, fraud, abuse have no place in any agency, especially not when it comes to guaranteeing our national security and readiness. Every dollar wasted or fraudulently spent is a dollar lost to our warfighters. They deserve better, and I look forward to working with you and the rest of this committee to increase transparency and financial integrity. I also share concerns about what we can expect from this process. As you know, the GAO has stated DOD has not yet demonstrated that its leadership has the ability to achieve effective financial management reform. The DOD lacks a sufficient cadre of financial managers with qualifications and level of expertise needed to lead reform throughout the department. Additionally, having looked at what occurred in the financial industry over time, I have concerns about how we're going to go about guaranteeing that this marriage between the DOD and the different auditors is one that's going to be transparent enough for us to understand that the taxpayer is getting the appropriate audits that we should be getting. Because as you know, what occurred in the financial industry was that basically the auditors did what the people being audited wanted them to do so that and they can get the next contract the next time it was around, or keep that contract. I really want to know how we're going to watch that issue. And Mr. Norquist, has DOD developed not only a process to guarantee that we're getting what we say we're going to get, but brought on additional personnel with demonstrated financial management experience. what barriers continue to impact DOD's ability to attract, retain, and develop qualified personnel, and retain is a very important issue when it comes to these types of things, and how will we verify the audits in the long term?
So let me cover a couple of points that you brought up, and I'll start first one with the independence of the auditors, because that's a central one that we had to address at the very beginning. The auditors do not report to the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. They do not report to me. They report to the IG. The IG is the contracting officer, oversees them, and makes the decisions about what they do, and so they have the same protected independence of the IG. But it's also a reason why we split the audit into lots of pieces. One is, an auditor cannot audit an agency if they have consulting work there. And so finding an audit firm who had no consulting work anywhere in the Department of Defense would be somewhat limited. But if you break it, Army, Navy, Air Force, DISA, Working Capital Fund, so forth, you'll find firms that are, and you'll find multiple ones so you can have competition. So part of having the 24 or more separate audits is, first, you get people who are independent, and second, we sustain the competition, that if there's an auditor who's not performing, the IG has multiple other auditors with DOD audit experience that they can go look to. So we thought through, because there's a question, why don't you just use one large audit? And my answer is, you've created a monopoly. We would never, after they learned our business process, be able to find another auditor who could compete, and then I'd be explaining to you why the audit costs went through the ceiling. So I think we tried to pay attention to the concerns that you've raised, and I think the IG function is a tremendous help for us in maintaining that independence.
Just to that point, because my time is running short, I appreciate the IG and its independence, but in the long run, the IG's been around for a long time. And a lot of things have been going on for a long time, whether it's fraud or abuse or just lack of information, and it hasn't come to anybody's attention of how to correct that. And so just the idea that the IG is going to be the independent evaluator of the process doesn't guarantee the taxpayer of America that this relationship is not going to be one that is controlled by those that know and can manipulate the system versus those that are responsible for making sure that we get what we're paying for. And it's verifiable. So I would like to talk to you a little bit more in depth about just where that goes, and I yield back.
Chairman Conway?
So, thank you. David, DFAS is an integral part of several of the accounting systems. Can you talk to the committee about the audit of DFAS per se, but also the conflict between the services that DFAS provided to the Army, Navy, Marine Corps that on a standalone basis, if those were audited separately going into DFAS to audit that service that was provided, would be really disruptive and inefficient. Can you talk to the committee about how the team is looking at solving that issue with respect to DFAS?
Sure. So we have a number of places where an audit of one of our entities would extend into another. So you think of the Army, Navy, and Air Force have financial management processes that extend into the Defense Finance and Accounting Service. So the way that we address that is we have the acronym is SSA 16. It's basically an audit of that organization's support to the others that external auditors can rely on. Otherwise, we'd be paying for the 3 or 4 different auditors to all show up and re-audit a single step. This interestingly shows up in DFAS. It also shows up with ammunition storage, where the several different services ammunition are held in one place. And the answer is, rather than each auditor coming in, we'll do a similar thing over ammunition storage and say, you can all rely on this audit piece so you don't have duplication of work.
So you talked about the accountability that you're going to create with this database of findings that are out there. Can you talk to us about the accountability piece? You've got two groups of folks that will be responsible for correcting or addressing the findings. You've got civilian folks as well as uniformed people. Can you talk to us about the carrots and sticks that you've got available to you to hold people accountable within your system for getting those findings resolved to the satisfaction of the auditor?
Absolutely, and I think there's a limit to them, and we may need to work with this committee on alternatives and additions going forward, but this was actually one of the first things that the Secretary of Defense brought up with me even before I was nominated, to say, how do you motivate people in a federal agency to stay focused on fixing things when you lack some of the incentives and controls you have in the private sector? So I think there's a couple things. One is being able to clearly identify who's accountable is one of the first steps, and so that's the part of it that the database gives us so that people know who it's on. The second is audit support shows up in people's performance evaluations, so there's no way around that comment being made about your contribution or your success, so that helps to drive it. Both the civilian and the military will have incentives. There are limits to how far we can go compared to the private sector, but I think the transparency and the accountability, knowing one of your biggest challenges, no one thinks it's their responsibility. And so fixing that and being very clear whose responsibility it is helps to drive that performance improvement. But there are limits to this that I recognize.
Well, it's that database is a big improvement from where we've been in the past, because sometimes the tasks just are so daunting that you can get away with not addressing it. But having it broken down into relatively speaking, bite-sized pieces, I think we'll see progress over the coming future. To Mr. O'Halloran's issue, these CPA firms that provide the audit are held to professional standards by their own industry and by the various state boards of accountancy. So it's not like you've got a group of folks out there who are not without oversight from professional standards and that they would have to ascribe to if they were working in a private sector audit as well.
Correct, and they are in fact audited on whether or not they met those audit standards, and they will have to produce to an external firm evidence that they did their audits to an acceptable standard.
So while not perfect, we're all humans, and there have been some audit failures in the past. Nevertheless, there are professionals and professional standards that those folks are held to.
Correct.
All right. Just a quick anecdote. Part of the issue has been over this time frame is making sure you had the right tone from the top. Leon Panetta started that, and I think it's been transitioned to the new administration this time really, really well. I was encouraged by the experience I had in Hawaii a while back. I was touring the USS Texas, which is a submarine. We were in the galley doing a town hall meeting for the enlisted guys, and somewhere during that conversation, one of the petty officers asked me, said, "Congressman, how's the audit going of the Department of Defense?" And which I thought was two things. You guys planted that guy down there because you knew I was going to be on board that ship. Or you've got some really bright enlisted guys who are paying attention to conversations that are going on throughout the food chain of the Department of Defense. And if the issue of auditability has gotten all the way down to a petty officer in the bowels of the USS Texas, then we must be making some progress. So with that, I yield back.
Ms. Davis.
And thank you as well, Mr. Norquist, and the efforts that are going in there. It's been a long-standing problem, and we all know that. I wanted you to speak a little bit, because I think we've addressed a few of the process issues, but particularly the concerns around cultural resistance to change. And if you could, I think one of the things that we're very aware of right now in any large bureaucracy, that there are a lot of issues, retribution for people who are trying to do the right thing and other people don't want them to, is a concern. Sexual harassment at the Pentagon is a big concern, as you've probably noticed through numerous reports. So I wonder if you could just speak to, there are all these issues that go on in people's workplaces, and that cultural resistance to change is one that really has to be monitored closely. And how are you dealing with that? How are you expecting to be able to bring everybody to the table on these issues and get the kind of buy-in that's necessary without individuals picking one another off?
The culture of resistance, I mean, no one wants to be audited. I don't know how many witnesses you've had come excitedly tell you, hey, I'm under audit today. But it's also that in order to fix the findings, we are taking systems and processes that were built to maximize support to one thing and requiring them to pay attention to the functions around them that they work with. And that can be a challenge because somebody says, well, this is how it disrupts it. So there's a couple of factors that go into this. The first is the tone from the top, and that comes from the secretary and the deputy secretary, who are unambiguously clear. This is about accountability, and they've sent letters to the workforce that emphasized this is about doing your job the way you're supposed to. These are what the accounting standards and the property standards and everything come from. You are responsible for this. So it's very clear running up your chain to say, I don't want to do this is not going to run into success. The other one is the Congress has been very clear, because the other place you go is to say, tell them to make them stop. right? And the likelihood of someone coming to Congress and saying, please make them stop the audit, and getting a warm and fuzzy hearing is pretty limited. So those two things help create the realization that the organization will need to change. The second part of that process is explaining to them the benefit of the change. In many cases, we have labor-intensive processes that are where data is transferred from one place to the other, and you have to fix errors because it wasn't done right at the beginning, or it was only filled in with the fields the people at the beginning needed. Well, if you can explain to them, when we get that fixed, you're going to spend less time doing this and more time on the things that you believe is your core mission. So yes, it's a little bit of work, and certainly the first year of an audit, when you're asked for records you don't necessarily have easy access to and you have to spend some time finding them, is a challenge. But over time, this will make your life easier. And we have to work that office by office and organization by organization. But as you pointed out, this is as much changing people's views about how to do things so that they understand the importance. The third factor is the audit's annual. You know, if you did this once and came back in 10 years, I don't know you have the same incentive to cultural change as the realization is they're coming back in 6 to 9 months. So you can make the change or you can watch them find the same things again. So that third factor, what makes the financial statement not different is it repeats. And they're not going to change the questions. They're just expecting you to have changed your ability to provide an answer.
Do you anticipate any need for a feedback system so everyone who's engaged in this can be giving their input all along the way, and some of that may be anonymous?
Yes, we need the feedback, and one of the things that I've tried to draw attention to is because the audit's going to repeat, what's important is that we be able to sustain this. So if you're given a task where the resistance is, this is just way too labor intensive, stop. Let's figure out why answering that auditor request is labor intensive and fix the way we store the data or do the check so we can answer them efficiently every year. I would rather take the finding the first year than do some Herculean expensive effort that I'm going to have to repeat the next year. So if we're not able to find the records efficiently, let's create a data warehouse, let's put the records where they can be easily searched. So next year, it's a very quick process. We want to make this efficient over time, and that's another way of reducing some of the resistance. So it's not, you know, the people have a way of saying, hey, I don't understand why this is happening this way. And the answer is maybe we can do it differently. But we're still going to have to meet the standards of the audit.
Yeah, thank you. And just speaking of the auditors, and obviously you're going to be using a lot of different ways of responding to some of the concerns that have been existing for some time. Is there anything in the training or preparation as you move forward that needs to be changed and that you're addressing as it relates to the way that people are approaching it?
So there's been a lot of effort on that. My predecessor, Bob Hale, set up a relatively robust training program for the financial management community that has been focused on introducing audits and audit readiness as a result of the input from committees and others. Extending that thoroughly through the logistics and the other organizations is probably one of our challenges. There's been some training, but those areas are as equally affected.
Ms. Hartzler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Norquist. This is a very encouraging day. It's a day we've been waiting on for a long time. I certainly want to commend the chairman, ranking member, and certainly my colleague, Representative Conaway, for his leadership on this. Because certainly we are facing so many threats around the world, and we need more dollars to modernize and to increase our readiness. But at the same time, I hear back home concerns about waste. And anytime there is waste, we need to make sure that it is rooted out and that we're investing our precious defense dollars where they need to go. And so this process that you're leading is critical in this effort. And so you noted that one of the chief benefits of the audit process is improved accountability of the assets and resources. So I was wondering, are classified assets part of the audit process?
Yes.
Okay.
Classified programs are included. I'll also tell you that all of the defense intelligence agencies have standalone full scope audits, and most of them have been under audit for 3 years. But being a classified program does not exempt you from the scope of the audit.
Okay. And then will there be a separate addendum then that we in Congress will be able to access to look at that portion, or how will there be accountability for the classified side?
Sure. So for the standalone audits, those are classified, the ones of an intelligence organization. For the others, how that shows up, I'd rather talk to you in a closed forum.
Okay.
But we address all of the classified programs they're in the scope of the audit.
How about OCO?
OCO would be in the scope of the audit, yes.
Okay, very good. In your testimony, you said something here that caught my attention. Of course, the cost you anticipate is $367 million, which we've already talked about, the long-term benefit of that investment in getting this a handle on everything. But you go on to say you anticipate spending about $551 million this year, in fiscal year 2018, fixing problems identified. So could you expound on what problems you anticipate and what the presumptions were to come up with that figure? Where do you get 551 for fixing problems?
Sure. So the number comes from talking to the services about what funding they have planned for this year and what did they have in the budget to address these requirements. And the types of requirements we're talking about is systems that have been already fielded for whom either they're not storing the data properly or they're not transmitting it properly, reducing manual passages between systems. So some of those changes are in there. Improvements in the way they inventory or store things. One of the steps is involved the accuracy of the property record. So each one of those places where they're improving their process or changing the underlying system or clearing up old records so that those are the things that are driving those types of costs.
So it sounds like the services already have a handle on what they know are problems.
Correct.
And then they put a price tag to that. And so most of that, it sounds like, is computer software?
Not most of it. That's just a piece of it.
You're
That's a
saying
piece of it.
systems. What?
It's a piece of it. It's not most of it, but the systems are certainly a piece of it.
Can you give more a specific breakdown on that? So you anticipate you're going to have to purchase so many more computer systems that talk to each other, and you say record management. So are you putting man hours? Are you anticipate additional personnel to create written records? I mean, get more specific, please.
Sure. So I may have to give you some of this for the record, but I'll try and talk you through what I can at this level. So when you're going through the audit, and for many of them, they've either done some work in advance, or in some cases, the auditors have done preliminary work on their statement of budget activities or other pieces before we got to the full scope audit. So they have some indication of the types of challenges they face, and they've developed corrective action plans for those. Some of those corrective action plans include modifying one system to allow them to be audit compliant and allow them to turn off systems that are not. So they're financial system costs that improve the accuracy of the data, and in the long term, may save us money as we turn off the legacy systems. The second is improving their processes that allow them to be more accountable for their property. And so they may be changing the way they store the information or they store the assets to support the accountability. Depending on some of them, may be switching to barcoding things that weren't so that they can have clearer accountability of the status of each asset where they know where they are. Some of it's the documentation behind it, making sure that's centralized in a way that they can respond and make sure it's complete. If you need it broken down further than that, I'll probably have to go back to and get the details behind it, but that's the types of, at a high level, the changes they're doing.
Yep, my time's almost gone. I would just say we need to watch this and don't let them get more money for something that simply should be their job.
Correct.
Doing their job. Okay, thank you. Go back.
Ms. Shea Porter.
Thank you. And I also want to thank you, Mr. Norquist. I'm very excited about this. We have hoped of this and for this for years. And I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about it. I think it was 2007 maybe, I was sitting here on this committee and we had found out that a lot of the weapons, the guns that had been sent to Iraq were not traceable anymore. And I remember the person, I can't recall his name, but saying, well, we didn't have enough auditors. And I said something along the lines of, well, shouldn't we have auditors in order, when we're spending this kind of money? So this sounds familiar to you, I'm sure. So how did you decide on the number of auditors, and what will you do if you discover that you need more?
Sure. So the number of auditors is our estimate based on what the contractors have proposed to do. They were given the scope of it. Those contracts, I believe, allow for them to make adjustments over time so that if there's a requirement for more. One of the things we want to do is make the best use of their time and their benefit to the taxpayer. So unlike some audits where as soon as they run into a problem, they get to stop and say, there's a problem, I'm done. The IG can say, hey, it would be useful to us if you dug deeper into the root cause behind it. And that way we make sure we're not just fixing the symptoms, and so they can drill down. And so my view is the auditor piece of this is like the reconnaissance and it's the guys who go out front and find you the issues, and that's a tremendous value to us. So if we need additional ones, I'm not hesitant to make sure we can get access to that.
So they will not be constrained financially if they need that. You won't run up against a wall where there's just no money left in the budget for them to put more people in if they need to.
It would have to be something in the way that the contract had been written, but we would realign funds if we needed to. If the IG said they needed additional resources, I will help the IG realign
Okay, and I
the
think that's pretty
resources.
essential because I have a
Absolutely.
feeling it's going to be deeper and longer than you think.
Correct.
Now, my understanding is right now you're talking about $870 million, and that's just for 2018?
That's for 2018.
Okay, so how is the CR going to be impacting that?
So the CR creates pressure on us funding-wise, and so I'm not going to stand in front of you and say, if I don't get it, we're going to stop the audits. We won't. We are going to go ahead with the audit. What it does, disruption-wise, is many of the people that I need focused on audit remediation are focused on trying to split contracts to accommodate the funding levels of the CR and the next increment, and so many of the people that we need to have focusing on this are the ones who are also affected by the incremental nature of a CR. It also creates pressure more on the remediation side than the audit because we're significantly below either what this committee recommended or the president, and we have to make trade-offs within that space. But we will still proceed with the audit.
Okay. And then the other question I had is, you talked about contractors having growing pains. Now, and I think in this article, you also said that we shouldn't be looking for like billions of savings, but there's always been kind of one of those understandings that if we actually did monitor these contracts over time, that the waste and fraud and et cetera delays actually does add up to billions. So how will they experience growing pains, and why don't you think that ultimately over a period of time we actually could save really significant numbers?
Okay, are you talking about saving numbers by auditing contractors?
Right, if
or-
we do this work now, and so what will you be doing to make sure, for example, that contractors come in on time, we don't have cost delays? I
Okay.
know that we have our work to do for the oversight, but I just want to know how you think your role will play out.
Sure. So let me break that into three parts. First is the piece which is the program manager overseeing it. That's not in the scope of the financial statement audit, but we support them with better quality data. The second, not inside this audit, but we have the Defense Contract Audit Agency that looks directly at billing. And they recovered in 2016, I think, like $3.6 billion by looking at billings that were coming in and questioning charges. That keeps up. That we will continue to do. The third is the financial statement audit, which focuses really on the department and indirectly on the contractors, but it's our payments to them. That one, I think the place you're going to see the biggest opportunity reform over time is by allowing us to operate more like a business. And so you think about improvements in the accuracy and the completeness of financial systems and the role of the chief management officer in trying to bring business reforms. Being able to put in front of the CMO information closer to what their commercial counterpart would have allows them to make decisions. Your $600 billion enterprise, better decision-making can make you make better use of the dollars on a very large scale. So I think you'll see that type of advantage in driving reform within the organization as we're able to do more in estimating costs or reforming the way we do something internally. So I think those are some of the three. There'll be some cost avoidance when you have better security of your systems against intrusion. You'll avoid costs that you otherwise have inflicted.
Right, and I'm hoping that we'll have more clarity when we have to make decisions, that we'll have more data to
Yes.
help us, right?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I yield back.
Mr. Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Norquist. Many of us are familiar with the audit function in the private sector. In preparing for this, I came across an acronym called an IPA, which, from my understanding, is a really good type of beer. But I think you mean something different. These are major, highly reputable private sector accounting firms to perform audits for large organizations across the world. If I got that right?
Correct. Ernst & Young, KPMG, large recognized firms.
And there's a set of auditing standards that's peculiar to the Pentagon or peculiar to government in general. What standards are they using when they perform their audit?
So there is a federal board that sets the auditing standards, and they basically start with the commercial standards, and then they add some modifications. For example, to defend the power of the purse of the U.S. Congress, we have budgetary rules that do not exist in the private sector.
Right.
They have a series of accounting standards for how we account for obligations, disbursements, commitments, things that matter to us in managing the money inconsistent with Congress. So there are changes. All the other federal agencies follow them as well, but there is an accounting standards board that does that.
Okay. Let me talk to you about continuing resolutions for a second. Recently, the Secretary of the Navy has said publicly that since the Budget Control Act was passed, the Navy itself, the Navy alone, has lost or we've wasted $4 billion as a result of continuing resolutions and budget uncertainty. Do you believe the audit will show inefficiencies like this in business operations across the department due to continuing resolutions?
I think the audit will show you some of the problems that will come out of business, out of the disruption from the CR. And I think one of the ways that that shows up, if you think about it, is normally you have a year to spend money. And one of the things that we tend not to like about federal agencies is at the fourth quarter, because of the way federal money works, if you don't spend it, you lose it, the sort of unusual thing that we do in the federal government. Well, the CR says wait, 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 and then when you're down to only a couple months left in the year, okay, here, have it all,
right.
Spend, spend, spend. And that, if you've negotiated a good price, you may now be outside the window of when you negotiated an effective price. Your plans for contracting and so forth get compressed. So I think some of those disruptions that you see that are driven by the CR, the audit will help be able to figure out either how to manage it or what the consequences are.
What would be helpful to us as the people that pass continuing resolutions to have that highlighted in your audit report so that we know that continuing resolutions have tangible negative results, not just to the operations, but to the expenditure of money for the entire Pentagon and each of the constituent services. I might add that during another part of my life, I was asked to take over the Alabama two-year college system at a time in which there were 2 criminal investigations going on, and the Birmingham News won the Pulitzer Prize reporting on corruption in it. And we used both the internal audit function and the external audit function, not just to remedy what had happened, but also to change the culture within the Alabama two-year college system. Do you believe that there will be some, I'm not saying wholesale change, but some change in the culture of the Pentagon as a result of these audits?
Absolutely. That's the point.
Good. Can you elaborate a little bit about what you would think how that would manifest itself?
Sure. I think that what you find is that are folks who are doing their mission, and one of their missions is to make sure information is updated for others to use. When their time is tight, that step gets skipped, and they do the others. Well, then others who rely on that information have to either redo it themselves or function with incomplete information. Knowing that that's going to be audited and somebody's going to point out that difference creates an incentive to make sure that you do the complete function and you get those items done. It should reduce the amount of phone calls the person gets to answer the question because somebody can rely on the system now. But that type of culture change is important in an organization that has such a spread of functions and has to rely on those types of data sets to be able to make decisions.
Well, I just want to say, Dr. Winstrom and I were just talking, this may be one of the most important things that we accomplished during our terms here in Congress. So I think you will see a lot of support for your activities here on this committee and throughout the Congress, and I appreciate what you're doing with that, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you for your support. I appreciate it.
Mr. Swazi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Norquist, I'm very excited about the work that you're doing. It's a gargantuan, mammoth, really big task that you have ahead of you. And you know, and I'm trained as a CPA and as an attorney, and I was the mayor of a small city and a county executive of a large county that didn't have proper inventory or procedures and processes in place, and went through this on a much smaller scale. And when I first came to Congress, I would hear my colleagues asking about different weapon systems and different pieces of equipment, and I didn't know what we owned. And I tried to get my staff to figure out what we owned by working together with the DOD and other people, and it was very hard to get the limited information we got. There's 14,500 aircraft in the U.S. military, for example. You know, how many ships do we have? How many armored vehicles? So on and so forth. Will we have a comprehensive inventory at the end of this process that tells us what we own?
So this is the important way of how we implement the audit. It is possible to have that without making it easily accessible, and my concern is you miss some of the benefit of the audit. So one of the changes we want to drive is not only to have the accurate count, but to have it easily researchable. In other words, in a data set where somebody can run the report and say to the Secretary of Defense, here's what you have, here's where they are, and here's whether or not they're in maintenance because they're not working, or here's whether they're working.
Well, that's the It's okay. Finish.
So the idea is we'll have the count. What we want to do is be more like a business, which is go beyond the mere standards of the audit to using that to drive business intelligence so that the leadership will have timely and accurate information, not just about the dollars, but about the facilities, the equipment, the military supplies behind those dollars.
So each piece of equipment will be rated, for example, as far as its condition and?
I'm not quite sure. I think the audit has to deal with impaired or not impaired, meaning is it usable? But we'll have those. Now, it has to be material enough, right? The audit doesn't
Right,
worry about
yeah.
small items, but the larger end items would certainly be things that we should be able to have timely and accurate reporting on.
What percentage of the overall audit would you say is going to be devoted to inventory as opposed to procedure and process and financial statements?
Well, you'll think, if you walk through, they'll do inventory, they will do property, meaning buildings and other large items. They'll also do pay and personnel, some of those types of things. So over time, that may be more labor intensive than most of the other pieces, but
Yeah.
it's one of many items. But it's on our property line, it's one of our largest.
So is it half the task? Is it a quarter of the task?
I'm guessing, but probably a quarter of the labor hours will be spent looking at those types of items, yes.
And will there be a physical visiting of the sites to actually identify the pieces by the auditors, or will that be done by our in-house, by the people who work for the DOD?
By the auditors. And they'll do it two ways, what they call book to floor and floor to book, which is they'll look at what your record says,
Yeah.
and then they'll see if that's what you really have in inventory, and they'll look at what you have in inventory and see is that what your records say. That way they're checking it both directions to make sure that they both align.
This is a very exciting task that you're going to accomplish. Do you think that that the audit of the inventory of equipment, of properties, of buildings will be conducted by the end of the calendar years of 2018, or will it be sometime off into the future after that?
So they will go through the audit this spring and summer. They will publish their reports starting about November 15th. This being a first-year audit may take
Yeah.
them a little bit of extra time. And they'll do this every year. So whether they'll do a sample, so they may pick certain pieces of equipment the first year and then pick a different set the next year. But the findings they have on one are often the same for the other. So as soon as we see them, that gives the agency a clear idea of what they
Oh, so there's only going to be a sample inventory of what we own. It's
But
not
it's a statistically significant, and the way they do their sample
I
is
know,
to use
yeah, yeah.
statistical sampling to be able to have a level of confidence in it, so that they will be on-site counting things, checking numbers.
Will we be able to find out from you, if I reach out to you afterwards, what you're going to be doing, what the sample size will be and what it will be of?
We should be able to have the information on the sample size. I don't know if it'll tell us exactly what they counted, but it will tell us the sample sizes, yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Norquist, for being here. I again want to echo thank you to Chairman Conaway for his efforts in getting this to come. It's a massive undertaking, long overdue. It's going to be very, very difficult. I hope that we will focus on the things that improve the processes going forward, and some of those, number one is OCO. There's a lot of room, even when people are trying to do that right, for abuses that are intentional and unintentional. And I'm more concerned about the unintentional, what people just don't know. How far back are you going to the start of the audit, like as far as OCO and those things?
So when you look at dollars in FY18, they will be auditing money received in fiscal year 18. When you look at assets acquired, it doesn't matter when the asset was acquired. They will look for existence and completeness of those assets.
Okay. Very, very good. And then just from having served quite a long time, I think some of the, I understand the process of at the end of the year, spend all the money or you lose it. That needs to be a recommendation that you don't lose it so that we can spend that money wisely. Maybe not in operations or maintenance, but there's some things, acquisitions, that it's important to be able to carry that money forward as long as it's earmarked or allocated to a source, even though it's not spent yet, rather than having to rush and spend it on things that you don't need, because you don't need to go buy all these pins to stack up somewhere for people to pilfer, because those little things add up. And I guess my final point is, I'm sure you'll look at things like OCIE turn-in, where we turn in equipment and those kind of things, and the write-offs and how you do that, and also like tool droppages, those things that, you come back from a field exercise in the Guard and you do all these tool droppages to make sure that you get your equipment back when maybe that's not the right way. So you will be looking at processes like that to make sure that people are adhering to the right way to do that and holding people accountable when they're accountable or service members as opposed to just saying, okay, it's within the dollars. Is that correct?
It will hold people accountable because we'll look at disposal of equipment. It depends on the size of the equipment. The audit doesn't go down to very small items, but did you properly dispose of it? Did you record it? And what, and then we'll start to be able to clearly see, did you get paid for the disposal? Because some of this equipment we do get money for when we dispose of it.
Okay, and I guess my final question is to the GAO indicates that the DOD lacks a sufficient number of financial managers, and what are you doing, or what areas has the department done to take care of to acquire these?
So this is a challenge. I mean, when you have an organization that's, most of it has never been under audit, and federal employees don't themselves conduct financial statement audits the way commercial enterprises do. So you may have CPAs, but you often have CPAs who don't have exposure to some of those other practices. And so over time, we've been able to grow that a couple of ways. The first is the agencies that went under audit first, like the Corps of Engineers. Corps of Engineers has a clean opinion. It had a number of people who've now been through an audit multiple times, know what it looks like, have been part of fixing things. They're now helping the Army get through the larger Army. So some of them we've grown by leading with certain examples. Some we've just gone out and hired. And then the third focus is training. We have a robust training program where we've been emphasizing audit standards, audit readiness, internal controls, all those pieces, whereas in a decade or two ago, it all have been budget type of topics and not accounting related topics, because that was the almost exclusive focus in a lot of the financial management community.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I have no more questions. I yield back my time.
Thank you. Mr. Norquist, I want to interject on one point Mr. Kelly raised. I am also very concerned that we are going to be so late in the fiscal year with a final appropriation, and the needs are so great that there's going to be inevitable problems as a result. And I'm thinking about the audit. You're going to find things, and you may not have, there may not be enough time to fix the things you find by the time the money is. So I think my staff has reached out to yours to work together to see about some greater flexibility in spending money after the end of the fiscal year. I think about our maintenance problems. They're enormous. And we don't want to waste money, but we also have got to get our ships and planes fixed.
Absolutely.
And so I think this is an area, and there's a lot of concern in Congress about accountability for the money, and I understand that. But I think this is an area where a number of us in Congress working with you in the department can have a better, especially this year, because we are going to be so late. So I just want to mention that because y'all were discussing it, even though it's a little different from the topic here. Mr. Panetta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Norquist, thank you very much for being here, taking the time, your testimony, but also thank you for helping us do our job and giving the people, providing them with accountability, providing the accountability to the American taxpayer. I appreciate that. Obviously, you have a tremendous amount of experience in doing what you're doing. 28 years, you actually were the CFO, you audited the DHS, that's correct. In the 6 months that you've been in this position, what has been the biggest lesson you've learned so far? And do you foresee any other potential delays besides the worrying about budget stability and funding, as you mentioned in your last sentence, in your last paragraph of your statement? Is there any other delays that you foresee that will prevent you from doing your job?
So I'll tell you the thing that surprised me the most was how many people who have been working this issue were eager for it to finally start. I have to tell you, for an accountant to be told to put together all these controls and all this stuff and then say, we're not doing the audit this year, and then do it again, and then each year they repeat that, you start to get to wondering, is it ever going to happen? So this built-up sense of, no, it's happening this year, and everything you've done up till now matters. The reaction I would get in rooms from the folks who've been working on this was really re-energizing, right? The sense of, excellent, right? We get to, we haven't been, there's been a lot of folks like wondering if they've been working in vain, but now the realization, no, everything you did to get ready to get these pieces in place will matter and pay off. So I think there's a very pleasant surprise on moving forward. I think the biggest concern in the long run is going to be the systems. because they take the longest to fix. Policies, procedures, even cultural changes we can do more quickly, but some of the system interfaces may take some more time. And so one of the things I'd encourage the committee as you go through each year's budget review, when somebody comes in and asks for money for a business system, make sure you understand, is it compliant? Have they prioritized the things related to the audit, or have they sort of pushed those down on their to-do list in place of something else? So there's often they don't get, I don't want to say they don't get much attention because I know their staff who spend a tremendous amount of time on this, but they're not sexy or glamorous, but making sure that the funding for those and the things that are being done, the systems phased out, those are the ones that will take us some time, but I think they have some tremendous long-term improvements for the department.
Great. Once again, thank you and good luck.
Well, thank you, sir.
I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Lamborn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing. And Mr. Norquist, I apologize. I'm probably going to be covering ground you've already covered. I was in another committee where we had a markup, and I just got here now. But from the 30,000-foot level, I really like that the audit will result in more accountability and more transparency. But the other thing that I think will be accomplished, I think is real important, and I'd like to get your thoughts, and that is reform. Uncovering where maybe we don't have the best practices in place, where there might be waste or duplication. Can you reassure not just the members of this committee, but by extension, the rest of our colleagues in Congress and the American taxpayers that you think that this audit will uncover where we're not spending money in the best way possible, so we can either lower the budget and accomplish the same thing or invest in more lethal capability for the DOD?
I think that's very essential in its contribution to reform. And I'm very excited about the possibility and how it's going to reinforce reform. So Deputy Secretary Shanahan has got the lead for bringing business process reform to the department. He set up organizations within the department that are working on this issue. I support them through the audit by helping to make sure that they have the business data they need to make those reform decisions. So as you look across organizations and you're comparing what do we pay in electrical rates across all of our different facilities, why? What are the highest ones? Why are they paying a higher rates, and what's the difference? What are the lower? So instead of somebody saying, everyone cut your number by 10%, we focus on those places where the costs seem out of line with the rest of the enterprise. That type of financial data, the accuracy of that, being able to pull it from multiple systems and have confidence in it, is what the audit gives you, and it's an enabler to reform. And so I'm sure we'll find within the financial processes, by removing places where we have to rework data because the accuracy will allow it to go faster, savings. But I'm more excited in the long run about what it allows the department to do to function like a business.
Thank you. And I know that Chairman and my colleague on my left here and many others have really been pushing for greater effectiveness and efficiency in how the dollars are spent. We have that trust to the American taxpayer. So will the outcome be not just that we find, hopefully, these efficiencies, but it's done in a way that the American people know that we're finding these, and the entire Congress knows that we're finding these efficiencies?
Yeah, so we will make sure, I mean, in front of it is the financial statement is public, so what the auditors find and what they then announce is closed, meaning what they've fixed, will be known. But I will also make a point of letting the committee know, here's how the reforms change things, and here's the way that our businesses run differently. For some of them, like the working capital funds, they bill for their services, so we can look at the rates they charge. Are they able to reduce their cost of operating? Because those are set up closer to a business-type function, and we'll be able to use that there as well.
Well, thank you for that, and I really appreciate it. The military of our country is held in the highest esteem by the American people. The only criticism that I'll sometimes hear is, are we spending the dollars the most effective way? And people are concerned about that. So thank you so much for what you're doing. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Veazey?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Norquist, I wanted to specifically ask you about just some of the issues that the outside auditors had that were brought in. Someone had asked a question a little bit earlier, but one of the reports that I read said that I guess that they were having some challenges being able to make final conclusions. Can you talk about some of the issues that the outside auditors that were brought in had?
Okay, so is there a particular one that you have that you're thinking about, or you just want me to walk through the challenges they face in general?
Yes, just in general.
So the first challenge an auditor faces in general is, and this is true government and commercial, they're required to be independent, which means the people showing up didn't used to work for you. So they've got to understand your business processes. And so we've put together in our different organizations guides that welcome them and say, here's how we're structured, here's what we do. When we spend money, the document looks like this, so they can start to recognize them and that they know what they're testing for the adequacy of. We've been doing the security clearances because a lot of them require security clearances to be able to do their work and get them through. A number of them are out doing site visits to get to understand what's going on at the different places. The Air Force auditor is at Tinker Air Force Base this week. The Navy auditors visit Naval Air Station Jacksonville and others in the fall to just see what the operations look like. So there's an orientation that they go through before they plan the audit to make sure that their audit is consistent, and then there's security clearances that we've been getting them through so they can start in a timely manner. Those are all some of the key pieces. There'll be a challenge on the volume. This isn't just a large audit for us. It's a large audit for them, but they've all scaled up for that exact challenge.
What about training and sustaining a workforce to be able to work specifically on financial management and what have you within DOD? Like what are some challenges around that? Because I would think that just being able to have a full-time staff, work solely on this, because this is obviously a big issue, must be a challenge in and of itself.
It is, and we've had to realign folks internally to be able to provide the time and attention on this to support them. These are some of the functions that over time when people took cuts, they sort of said, well, I can reduce this because there's not an audit and accountability. Some of those functions are being restored. But we're doing internal trade-offs on that. We're basically operating underneath the reduction accounts that the legislation put in place. But those are realigning forces within it. I will tell you that over time, what I will likely come back to you with is shifting some of the work where we hired an outside firm as a consultant to something run by a federal employee by trading off contracting dollars for federal employee dollars, because we're going to need those capabilities in-house. So in some cases, we hired the expertise, and we may change the balance of that over time as we realize this function is going to stay, and we want to make sure federal employees are able to do that on a sustained basis. There's still always a use for skilled experts on the outside on particular topics, but you want to change that dependency over time.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Conway.
Thank you. Two other things real quick. The department is constantly facing funding challenges, et cetera, et cetera. David, do you think you've got the right position or strength of position to be able to maintain and protect the funding to get all of this done? Because it's going to be setting priorities and trading these dollars that are going to be needed to get this done over time versus spending them somewhere else of importance within the department. Do you think you have the right support from the Secretary and others to be able to make a cogent argument that you need these funds to continue the audits and continue the fixes?
I do. I have the full support of the Secretary and the Deputy Secretary. I will tell you at the President's budget level or the committee level, I'm very comfortable. If you start talking about a CR that runs through the year, we're in a very different place. And that just creates challenges because of very tough trade-offs across the department. I'll fight to protect this, but we have readiness issues and others that I'd have to be paying attention to as well.
And then the BCA levels would be a disaster?
That'd be a disaster.
Okay. And then on the database of findings, there will be some findings that are more important than others. Just so when it first comes out, just the scope of the number of findings will probably be startling. Will the CPA firms grade those findings as to ones that are, for lack of a better phrase, is really critical or systemic versus ones that are easily fixed and should go away shortly? Is there going to be some sort of a grade there that'll help bifurcate it into to places so we can better understand just the sheer number?
So they will score it and weight it with terms like material deficiency and others that relate to its size compared to the financial statement. That's not necessarily its importance to the department in terms of fixing. They may decide that there's a cyber vulnerability that has very little dollar value that we think has a security issue that makes it one of the first things we fix. Or we may see a change where the savings are there and we want to do that fix first. So we'll have their scores in terms of how they categorize it, but then we'll need to prioritize within the department which of these reforms are most important to get done to support the chief management officer, to save the taxpayers money, And some of the later ones, even if they're large dollar values, like valuation of old military equipment, if we don't think that's data that people are going to use right away, we may wait on some of those reforms to prioritize the other things first.
And so on the assignment of responsibility to fix, it will come with a time frame that's rational and expected to be met?
Yeah, generally, I'd expect the time frame to come from the corrective action plan where we'll check, is this a reasonable time frame? But some of these will take some period of time, but you can see the reduction in the conditions within it that will show you they're making progress.
All right, thank you. Mr. Chairman, you're back.
Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Norquist, thank you for testimony and for the work that you are doing and will continue to do. I think it's vitally important for the department and ultimately for the taxpayer to make sure that we're spending dollars the way they should be spent and we're getting the most for them. And this auditing function is something that I've had a longstanding interest in, and I remember years ago serving on the Intelligence Committee, and we had somebody from DOD there, and I asked the question, well, you know, what about the auditing function to make sure that we're spending dollars wisely? And it was then that I became aware that we don't do the auditing function. So long overdue, and I'm glad we're finally getting to this point. So many of the questions I had have for the most part been addressed, but I did have one area I just wanted to delve in just a little deeper. And so while conducting an audit of this magnitude, I guess I want to know, how do you plan to deal with the significant complexities that it may present dealing with, for example, old contracts or contracts and systems not designed with an audit in mind, or auditing in particular the classified portion of the budget. This is a particular area of interest that I would have, and where there's, you know, by design, there's not much transparency into black projects and programs for security reasons. How do you deal with those issues, and does guidance for new contracts provide for the eventuality of an audit? So if you can take those on.
Sure. So there are a couple of pieces. So the first one you bring up is in contracts. And there are some issues where, in order to, for example, property value military equipment, we need the contractor to give us their invoices set up a certain way so we can see the pieces that are included. Older contracts don't have that. So you look at which ones do you modify, which ones do you build on, and are there some places where you do an alternate way of valuing that equipment? There's different methodologies you can do valuation, and you try and decide from a accuracy and a taxpayer point of view, what's the best use of taxpayer money? How do we do that most efficiently? Some equipment, if you think it's going to go out of inventory, you might decide, I'm not going to spend a lot of energy on it. Over the next couple of years, it won't be here anymore. So that's not as essential. It's not a highest priority. With regard to systems, I think you have to look at each system and ask the question, can I fix it to do what we need it to do through a software patch or upgrade? Can I replace it by moving its work to something else? Or do I have to work around it in some sort of manual form till that system is eventually retired and a follow-on? Each of the services, each of the organizations is going through that. Defense, DAI is the name of an accounting system that has been implemented across 20 defense-wide organizations. So in that case, the answer was just turn them all off. We're just going across the defense-wide entities, and we're just turning off and replacing those. In the services, there's a lot more of consolidating. They're going from several accounting systems down to fewer that are compliant and support an opinion. With regard to the classified, I may need to talk to you offline about how we handle it. I'll just assure you a couple things. One is classified programs are included in the audit. We have cleared auditors and cleared IGs and others who can do this. And as you mentioned from the intelligence community, they all receive standalone opinions, and so they actually have been under audit for 3 years now. And I've been meeting with them, getting an update on their lessons learned and their issues and how they've been progressing. But those are published on a classified form, and the members of Congress are entitled to look at those.
And for the classified programs going forward, will those all be in-house auditors and not outside contractors?
Can I address all of those in a different format so that at a certain point I'm going to run into classification concerns. So let me just assure you that they're included, and then we can talk about the mechanics of it in a different way.
Sure. Yeah, I'd like to do that. Very good. Well, thank you very much for the work you're doing with that, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Mr. McEachin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Norquist, for being here. It's my understanding that the Army, Navy, Air Force, Defense Health Programs, Defense Logistics Agency, U.S. Special Operations Command, and Transportation Command still have not received a clean audit opinion from the DOD IG. Can you talk about how you approach auditing these divisions of DOD over the course of FY18 and during the audit process?
Sure. As you pointed out, there's some that have, and then there's a series that haven't. Some of those, like DLA, have begun the audit. So DLA was under audit this previous year in fiscal year 17, as was DISA was under audit in 16, and the U.S. Marine Corps went under audit this year for the first time in 17. So some of them have a year or two of experience. The Army, Navy, and Air Force, what they're doing is they're splitting their audits into two parts. They basically have a section of their Army that's funded through what's called general funds, meaning appropriations directly from Congress, and another that is what's called working capital fund, meaning it bills for its services, so it looks more like a company. They each have different accounting systems, and so while the same auditor does both, they've split the opinion into two parts because the way they function is different. But that will also allow us to see the progress within each of those organizations. So that split occurs in the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. The other ones, most of them get standalones. If they're too small, they'll be covered by the IG rather than get a standalone opinion. They'll all be rolled together by the IG to give an opinion on the department as a whole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Norquist, you referenced this earlier, but I want to ask again, in these efforts, do you have the support of the Secretary of Defense and the Deputy Secretary? Because what you've talked about is cultural change, it is prioritizing dollars, it involves a number of things that, if they're not supported by the top leadership, are not going to happen.
Absolutely. The tone from the top is excellent.
Well, the first conversation I had with the Secretary after he was nominated to be Secretary, he brought this up on his own. So my experience with him is that he believes this is very important, and I just think you've got to have that support from him to make this successful, I think. You good?
I just want to brag on the chairman for having the very first hearing of calendar 18 was on this issue, and highlight that, and I appreciate your keen continued support for getting this done, and that tone from the top that you set is much appreciated. So, how do you go back?
Well, I appreciate it, but I think all members, as I said at the beginning, this has been a bipartisan priority for years, and we're going to stand there right with you, Mr. Norquist, to make sure that it actually occurs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
With that, the hearing is adjourned.